Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Left Hand. Today's episode is going to be a bit of a different one. A few weeks ago, I published a blog post called Corduroy Psychedelia, Boards of Canada, Hauntology, and the PBS Unconscious. And the response to it made it clear that we needed to bring it into a full conversation. So that's what we're doing here today with Emma Stamm and Bob Langan, digging into nostalgia, childhood, wonder, public broadcasting, and what it might mean politically that so much of that shared cultural world might no longer exist. Before we get into it, however, if you have been waiting for the right moment to take a course with the Asset Horizon Research Commons, now is that moment. We have just launched the AHRC Summer School. 6 seminars, 6 extraordinary instructors, running from May all the way through September, covering everything from Fanon and anti-civilization to the obsolescence of the human and the aesthetics of liberation. And it is the most ambitious schedule of classes that we have put together to date. And if you are a patron of Left Hand, you are already sitting on a steep discount on the full summer school bundle, alongside other discounts to AHRC courses and the course archive. Head to the Patreon to find your code before it expires on May 13th. Details and enrollment at assethorizonpodcast.com. Okay, let's get into today's discussion. This is Left Hand, and I am your host, Sereptie, also known as Craig from the Asset Horizon podcast. And today's discussion, I suppose, is a kind of special one because the basis for our talk today comes from a blog post that I posted what now seems to be about a month ago or maybe 3 weeks ago now, that perhaps some of you had read. It was called Corduroy Psychedelia, Boards of Canada, Hauntology, and the PBS Unconscious. The reason for me writing this particular blog was long coming. I had a series of undeveloped and inchoate thoughts over a period of years, if not decades, about some of the ideas in that particular piece that all came together in part due to a series of events that led up to the release of a track by Boards of Canada, 13 years in the wake of their last major release. Not that the release by Boards of Canada is in and of itself a reason to talk about what we're going to discuss here today, but there is another side to the blog piece that I wrote that I wanted to dig in with, particularly with folks who are from the United States. Unfortunately, the two people that we have in our discussion today are also from the East Coast. So there's a kind of cultural clustering here that hopefully we can dig into and make some sense of the claims that I made in this blog piece. I initially resisted the idea of even talking about something that I wrote for a blog. Usually we're covering figures, Bataille, or talking about Mark Fisher or something like that. But why shouldn't we talk about our stuff? Right? So we hope to be anyway on the bleeding edge of philosophy, theory, and culture and what have you. But in the discussion today, I have our trusty co-host, Emma Stamm, and also our friend, Bob Langan, who many may recall from the episode that we did on Jung and Spinoza, which I believe was more than a year ago. But Bob has been in the mix for various things, including the Anti-Oedipus Files reading group for Asset Horizon. And more recently, he joined me for a discussion with Charles Stivall on Deleuze's seminars. And we talked about Spinoza a little bit there. So just to get started, I want to discuss this concept of a national broadcast unconscious, and particularly how it relates to the way we think about nostalgia in America, and maybe some thresholds that we have crossed, not only as a nation and a culture, but really as a sort of global assemblage where a certain kind of encounter perhaps no longer exists within the cultural conjuncture in which we live. And I want to also talk about, for example, how in the 70s, 80s, and maybe even up to the 90s, there was a kind of shared civic idealism attached to the institution of public broadcasting. In my blog, one of the things that I bring up is how in the PBS of the late 70s and early 80s seemed to put forward this image or uplift this image of the child, the well-nurtured child, as someone who might be able to redeem the excesses and injustices of the American empire at that time. And it did so through what I would call a pedagogical accent, an emphasis on things like Sesame Street, the Electric Company, 3-2-1 Contact. And of course, your experience of this may be different depending on which generation you're from. I'm a Gen X kid, and the friends that I have in the discussion today, I guess we could call them millennials. But anyway, with that in mind, I've already put a few ideas out there and I've done all of the talking, but we have Bob and Emma in the discussion. Since Bob is the guest, we'll give him a little bit of an introduction. Bob, feel free to say a few things about yourself and maybe some of the reactions that you had to those claims in my blog and about the questions in focus today.
Sure. Thanks, Craig. Right. So I hold a doctorate in psychoanalytic studies from University of Essex, and my thesis, which later I was able to publish as a book, is on Jung and Spinoza, and that's where my core interests lie, that intersection between depth psychology and continental philosophy. Your article about Boards of Canada and nostalgia, even though there might be somewhat of a generation gap there, it definitely did hit home with me. You evoked the sick day you talked about, and that watching PBS in your convalescence and it evoking a sense of wonder in you certainly hit home with me. And certainly in my own childhood, whether it was a sick day or just even after school, watching a documentary on PBS, or by the time I was in my childhood, cable was more ubiquitous and we had basic cable. So it wasn't always PBS, but PBS certainly was that main fount for that sense of wonder. And I would say whatever that affect is, or if it's indicative or implies some kind of psychic common that transcends the drudgery of childhood and watching your parents go through 9 to 5, the typical life, the mundane world, it was definitely there. Maybe it was a naive sort of wonder, but it was certainly there. And your article evoked that for me. And I think how that eventually was foreclosed, or how that eventually got destroyed as one enters adulthood and as time passed and as PBS itself and public broadcasting sort of got fractured and ultimately defunded in more recent times. I mean, that trying to preserve that sense of wonder, I think it's something that I've carried through my whole life, and how I went from certain ideas of what I was going to do with my life to eventually philosophy and psychology. And that's a very twisted road to get there, but your article definitely reminded me of that path taken.
When I was reading your article, it occurred to me that what you call under-theorized Corduroy Psychedelia, I think is indeed under-theorized in and of itself. But sitting with the ideas that you were putting forward, I couldn't stop thinking about how we don't have a general flexible theory that we can apply to affects from different eras, from different decades. I do relate to everything that you were talking about in that blog. I'm one of the 90s kids that has these sick day memories and watched a lot of PBS growing up. But what you're touching on, as specific as it is in a certain sense, I think we can use it as an entree to a much broader discussion about what it means to, as Fisher puts it in the unfinished introduction to Acid Communism, to unforget. Not to remember, but to retrace steps back and look at the events and the material conditions that prevented a passage forward in time from a particular moment, let's say the early to mid 90s, to a later state where the people who were living through that moment could understand the affects well enough to render them in political terms. So I see a lot of this as, even though it's very much about what it's about, it's not just applicable to us as millennials and Gen Xers, but I think there's a way that this can make sense for Gen Z and for the baby boomers as well. So the sort of broader theoretical context is something that I'm never losing sight of.
Really, there's so much that we could talk about, and many threads that we can pick up to really begin this discussion. I think the first thing that comes to me here is, well, I'll just give away the game. The first and biggest question that is sort of looming behind not only this discussion, but the authoring of the blog, and I guess you would say my work and interests more broadly, is the extent to which that some sort of cultural cohesion or some sort of shared transversal cultural thread is not only required for something like a revolution to take place, but may even be its absolute condition of possibility in some sense. Because, and maybe just as a starting point, I will talk about the Boards of Canada phenomenon. I think the fact that a group like Boards of Canada essentially took nostalgia as a thematic object of their music, but did so in a way that doesn't have the sort of pronounced edge that something like Stranger Things has done. It's more steeped in it rather than wearing it as an emblem. And given the fact that this particular band and their releases like literally span decades now, whose schedule of releases has been so far apart, they've set themselves up to be this particular cultural entity, almost like an egregore of sorts, I guess you would say. And what I saw recently, it struck a chord with me online once Boards of Canada put out music after 13 years, and seeing what that release had done for generations of all kinds of people, from what I called the Boards of Canadads, which would include me and anybody who's between the ages of 41 and 52 years old who responded online to the release of that music, but also the people who found out about this music from 3 months ago. And look, it doesn't just have to be Boards of Canada, but I think they are a paradigm case in some way where in this moment, just given the absolute shit state of the world right now, there is this cultural or aesthetic intervention that everybody was able to sort of occupy this particular aesthetic position, at least for a short time, and see in that space just the mutual affinity that people not only had with the music, but with each other and their love of that music. And it's something that I don't often see the brute political realm producing. And it brings me back to the thought that Bataille has about trying to capture from fascism the affinity for mythology. Basically, Bataille seeing the excesses of Nazi Germany, the excesses of the Stalinism of his time, and seeing that a real revolution, so to speak, or an effective one that would truly bind the people, needs to take hold or needs to capture the imagination of people in the same way, or at least with an eye for the same affects that the Nazis in Germany and Italy had, I mean, particularly Nazi Germany. And of course, this engenders all kinds of risks. To say the least, just a fandom I don't think is going to save the world. But at the same time, I think that's something that needs to be analyzed, at least in terms of the effectivity that it has in bringing folks together.
Yeah, I mean, everything you're saying there, I think, is germane to the question of, okay, this national broadcasting and this national broadcasting unconscious that things like PBS engendered, is it actually a useful teaching tool, or is it just giving us sort of a canned affect, but because it's not really producing structural change, is it a failure from the start? And that question posed to me, my answer is it's a bit of both to me, honestly, which indeed that sort of progressive feeling of let's care about the animals, let's care about diversity, let's care about civic duty without any roadmap to implement it, especially when you're a kid. I mean, that's why its disaster and its apocalypse is almost assured, because those things are great to watch as a child, but then the world so flatly rejects it as you enter it and enter adulthood as well. But, and I think this goes back also to the conversation you had with Federico Campagna last summer, which is the material conditions are paramount. However, it is good to give someone an imaginal or an ideal or mythical thing to strive towards, because it does engender some sort of affect, ideally, that is positive, or in the Spinoza sense, active joy, perhaps, to strive for as well. And I kind of wonder if national broadcasting and the sort of wonder that it instilled in one as a child is that sort of an example of almost a symbol of, okay, this is an act of joy. And just unfortunately, the roadmap there was obliterated. However, that is still some sort of thing to strive for, something to keep in mind. I was thinking, the other thing I was thinking when I was reading your piece, Craig, which instead of the Corduroy Psychedelia, for someone of my age, what would be the appropriate sort of image or symbol to go with? And this doesn't quite work, because I'd be curious if, Emma, you would agree with this, but this doesn't quite work because this would be at the turn of the century. But for me, it was almost the cult of the compact disc. I was thinking, because there are things that, Napster, obviously, that was sort of the Wild West at the time, and downloading things and importing them and smuggling them and transcribing them onto a disc. That was almost a way of keeping things that were starting to fall apart. Joys for me, different music, a different comedian, so to speak, like George Carlin was a big influence on me in 8th grade. But to sort of import all that and put it on a disc and smuggle it away in the face of a world that just was rejecting that sort of wonder that as a child I took very naively and earnestly as, yes, this is good. It was almost a way of protecting it from a world that couldn't tolerate it, just like it couldn't tolerate that sort of consciousness, as flawed as it may be, without any foundational practice or praxis of making it work. But I just wonder if that affect that it represented still has some utility in saying this is something to strive for on both a spiritual and material basis.
Yeah, when I think about being 14 years old and trading playlists on burned CDs strictly from music illegally downloaded off Napster and Kaza, it's a joy. It's something I'll never have again, sadly. This is an interesting direction to go in, because often I think about my experiences with the internet in the late 1990s and early aughts, and how, while it accelerated the transition to adulthood in certain ways, and I may not need to put too fine a point on that, about having access to the wild west of the internet when you're 12 years old, and it's far less surveilled and regulated than it is today. So it accelerated the passage to adulthood in certain ways, but it also prolonged this sense of having a bubble around you as a child, I think, because back then, this was pre-smartphone era, so pre-2007, which is when the iPhone was first rolled out, and none of its precursors, the Palm Pilot, BlackBerry, they don't count. The smartphone era began in 2007, and parents didn't text. Parents were not using the proto-social media that we had back then, LiveJournal, Zanga, which I know is not strictly a millennial thing. In fact, our Gen X and maybe even boomer forebears were also there, but certainly my parents weren't. And I think a lot of parents of millennials were not really online in the way that we were. So it was like a shared adolescent consciousness that had to do with this expansive freedom of information that to me did nothing but reinforce just a childlike and teenager-like also sense of wonder at the world. And what makes this interesting politically and ties it back to the PBS discussion is that there are political material conditions that allowed for that. That internet doesn't exist anymore for reasons to do with regulation, with the advent of Web 2.0 and corporate interests fully structuring the internet at this point. And so we can put this into a timeline that begins perhaps before the golden age of PBS, perhaps. And I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I am very sad when I think about how Gen Z and Gen Alpha don't have that. And it's hard for me not to see what's happening with the decline of PBS and then the decline of the old internet as not to be reductive, but just sort of a straightforward intensification and spread of capital into all areas of material life, and no less than that, all areas of consciousness.
Yeah, the one thing that, well, I guess as a Gen Xer, I certainly did have the experience of downloading from Napster, Kazaa, don't forget LimeWire, of course, all great stuff. I mean, the irony there is sometimes you got extremely degraded versions of tracks and films, and maybe that's part of the fun. It gave it a sort of pirate feel. But I think the whole Napster phenomenon can be a bit of a paradigmatic example for everything that we're talking about, because in the wake of the regulation that occurred that put to rest things like Napster and Kazaa, and then, of course, the formalization of streaming platforms like Spotify and Apple Music and all that, is that, at least in that moment, from one vantage point, that was a kind of sealing up of the striated space that was, and maybe even the more nomadic tendencies of technology of that time, where technology became, in the Deleuze-Guattarian sense, a war machine that was able to skirt the powers and the laws of the state. And who were the beneficiaries of that? 12-year-old kids, primarily, downloading Metallica and Foo Fighters and whatever else was popular at the time. But Pearl Jam for some of us in the room right now. But what's interesting to me is the creation of a kind of false smooth space where now we don't have access to that back panel that gets us these extremely degraded versions of our favorite songs. And the way to get them is on the platform like Spotify and Apple. And then it's also created a kind of consumer and a kind of subject who's more accustomed to using those platforms. And the same thing is happening to PDFs now, too. I mean, the crackdown on everything from Sci-Hub to Anna's Archive and all of those places, it's harder to grab a journal article that was written 20 years ago that you need for your paper or whatever that you're working on, and now you have to ask people in a Discord server for it. So there is a sense in which the continuity of our global culture is in constant flight from those powers, foreclosing those little gaps in the interstices of digital culture and just culture more generally, where access was unmediated, and creating more structures of mediation in between there. I mean, if we want to fly all the way back to the late 70s and early 80s, Bob was mentioning at the top of the discussion how premium cable came in and made it look. If I'm sick at home in 1989 and Terminator 2, no, actually Terminator 2 wouldn't be on, 1993, and Terminator 2 is playing, I am not watching Sesame Street, right? And I remember too, here's my Gen X moment, was there was a time in the early 80s for our family, I was in a constantly downwardly mobile working class family. My dad he worked in the steel and made a good income in the late 60s and throughout the 70s, but he didn't get raises after that. So basically, as the emergent middle class, many of whom were, I guess we would say, professional, managerial class folks coming into the middle class at that time where I lived, housing development springing up. I mean, very typical of that whole joke about cut down all the trees and name all the new streets after them. Like that sort of phenomenon was happening where I live, and I lived in residential farmland on the edge of that. So my family, we didn't get premium cable until maybe like 2 or 3 years or 4 years after it had become really popular. And then you had to get the box in your house, and then you basically rented the box and then paid for individual channels. And I mean, it's kind of like that now too. It's just that everything is just squeezed inside the TV, or is just in the cloud, if you will. But at that time, that became the new line of flight. That was a more formalized platform by which you could explore the objects of culture. In a sense, it was ending that more aleatory thing where, like, well, Price is Right is over. I'm not going to, that was the only game show that I watched. Now I'm stuck with PBS. And it's in this vector that you're going to get this thing that's unusual, that cuts against the grain of your ordinary giddy daytime soap operas and game shows that network TV was putting out. And it has that sort of teacherly, very dry, almost hokey aspect to it. And I think this is the paradox of PBS, is that on the one hand, all of that stuff seemed very much like school in some ways. But then some of the programming was really odd and weird and psychedelic, like that short film, An Occurrence of Owl Creek Bridge, that I talked about, which is very much like Em and I were talking just before we started recording, Picnic at Hanging Rock, where you have this figure who hallucinates this escape. And then there's a reversal at the end where we find out this figure did not make it out. Picnic at Hanging Rock is somewhat the same, where there is this sort of line of flight, transcendence to another world, and an escape from all of the pressures of Victorian and colonial society in that moment, but showing a way out of it. And you would see these kinds of things on PBS amidst all of the other pedagogical, teacherly sort of things. And then that encounter became diminished as time went by. Now you have HBO, you have Cinemax, and you can watch all of the primetime blockbuster films and what have you. And it seemed like that gap was just getting narrower and narrower.
Picnic at Hanging Rock is a remarkable film. As we were saying before we started recording, it's thematized in the last lecture that I gave for the Acid Communism course that I taught for the Acid Horizon Research Commons. What is especially interesting about Picnic at Hanging Rock and some of the classically PBS-ish works, one thing that I think about when I think about PBS is their show, The Voyage of the Mimi, which stars a very young Ben Affleck. And I suppose it's not as superficially weird as some other stuff, but that's my version of my childhood experience at PBS, because we were forced to watch that in school. And it's so much stranger than anything I think that they would show to kids today. But at any rate, there is this overwhelming impression of a political message. It's a utopianism. It's a possibility. And in a Picnic at Hanging Rock, you can read it on one level as being about, quote unquote, about the repressiveness of Victorian England playing out in rural Australia, where it takes place. And there is so much symbolism around these young women and their teachers going off on this hike and letting go of the literal and figurative garments of the patriarchy. But what's really revolutionary, and that's quite a word, but I think it's appropriate here, are the aesthetics. And we can talk about whether aestheticization in this matrix is simply retreat into the self and regressively subjective, or if there's a politics to it. I think it's an interesting conversation, but I would put my cards on the table and say that it's rigorously, thoroughly political. The ambiance of Picnic at Hanging Rock and so much of the PBS stuff, including The Voyage of the Mimi, which is normal enough to be shown in a school to children as it was to me, it presents shared consciousness in a way that people no longer experience consciousness. I think there's this blurriness to it. There's this feeling of either a come up or a come down on psychedelics. And I know that in the Corduroy Psychedelia piece, the drugs of it all was not front and center, but whether we want to call it altered consciousness or something else, there is a difference in consciousness that comes out through the grain of the film or the grain of the sound, through the use of light. In the essay on Picnic at Hanging Rock that Fisher has in The Weird and the Eerie, he really emphasizes how bright the film is. It's very, very eerie, but it's just saturated with this strange light. And there's this impression that this is not a representation of something that we were supposed to take as one person becoming insane or one person becoming liberated, but something that we were all theoretically capable of entering into. So yeah, I don't want to go on for too long about this, but this is one of the threads that I think we can pull about what the substrate of collective consciousness, whether it's television or music, says about what we think is even possible as sort of a normal way of thinking and feeling collectively on a regular basis.
Yeah, this film is actually held up by the guys in Boards of Canada as one of their primary influences for making music, interestingly. Emma, we should have done a whole episode on this particular film, but there's a few interesting things that we can say right off the bat, especially as it relates to the psychedelic experience. And Emma, as you and I have talked before in our conversation with Sujit, I think my most psychedelic experiences in this life did not involve drugs. Absolutely, they did not. And when I watch a film like that, I mean, it is an absolutely psychedelic film. And one of the reasons, which Emma already touched upon here, is the very textural nature of the film. As Mark Fisher seems to point out, it's bright, it's super saturated. But when you're watching this film, it's a mixture of European and British upper class young college women who are basically going to this small college in Australia. And in the context of the film, there are some other, it seems like long-timers, like people who are descendants of other colonists and what have you, who seem a bit more on the native side. And I don't think there's but one person of color in the film, and he doesn't speak. But with that said, the film just seems so hot and just so dusty and so caustic, and grass barbs and hot stone and then cool stone as well. It's a very temperature-based film, the way that I looked at it. And you go through that psychedelic threshold through a transition of various textures and temperatures in the film. And the one thing that I don't think I got, like watching game shows and soap operas, and when you're sick as a child watching TV, all of those impressions come in at a level of intensity that's a lot higher than normal. So the ambient giddiness of The Price is Right just has this overstimulating effect. And then you watch something like that and you can almost feel the actual burn of the film on your skin. And it just sits way more intimately. And I think that was part of the inspiration for what I'm calling the Corduroy Psychedelic, is that in those intense moments, something hit you in a way that was absolutely other to what was ordinarily presented to you as being the norm, let's say. And apologies to Bob, because we're basically explaining the whole film here, but you should definitely watch it anyway.
Well, it sounds like a banger of a film, but having not seen it, I can't comment wholly on it. But two thoughts occurred to me while you guys were discussing it. Even the more just straightforward pedagogical stuff on PBS, for me at least, still offered some line of escape, even if it was in a passing down civic virtues or being very didactic about science. But those for me were still sort of, again, instilling that affect of wonder, whether it was Kratz Creatures was a nature show on in the 90s that I remember watching a lot, or even something that was just more about behavior and civic value and community, like a Shining Time Station, for instance, which again, years later when I realized that George Carlin was Mr. Conductor, that threw me for a loop. But at any rate, those still for me were sort of a oasis, even if they weren't quite as certainly intense of an affect as what you're talking about. But the flip side to that for me was, again, because like you just said, yeah, I'm sick from home and I could watch nature shows, but Ninja Turtles is on Nickelodeon or whatever, so fuck that, right? Like I did have these other options. And with those options came things that weren't quite within that earnest sort of aesthetic of that sometimes PBS had. So for instance, I distinctly remember being sick in the late 90s, being from home and watching the History Channel. And this was before the History Channel. I don't even know what the hell it is now, if it even still exists, but before it became pawn shop shows and things like that, where they had, I forget the name of the program, but it was a conspiracy. They ran like a double header of these conspiracy documentaries. And one was about JFK and his assassination. And the other was about people having premonitions of plane crashes and the CIA investigating it. Now listen, like for a sixth grader or fifth grader, however old I was at the time, like watching this shit in the middle of the day while you're sick, it was a little unsettling. I'm not going to lie. And I think it sort of revealed this paranoia throughout the 90s that as a kid, I just was not aware of. And those were my first little glimpses into it of like, oh shit. Like, what if I have a dream of a plane crash? What does that mean? Obviously, I don't have any Jungian scaffolding at the time to grapple with that in any intelligent way. But again, I think that was an example of maybe the affect that something like PBS gave me was very ill-equipped for reality itself, because then how do you get there to that point? And that's where this intersection of, okay, is this just ascetic retreat into subjectivity, as Emma said, or is it doing something more productive as well? And the struggle to meet that in the middle, I think, is a really, really interesting discussion.
Bob, I wanted to ask you if you could comment on the connection between the PBS Unconscious and what we've been discussing with respect to childhood and the uncanny, the unheimlich, because as I was rereading Craig's blog for today, that was so front and center for me. And I was listening to Boards of Canada this morning, getting ready, and I just had this strong impression that there are some interesting things to be said probably about the relationship between uncanniness, childhood, the domestic childhood as an experience of nothing but familiarity and recognizability. And of course, the uncanny is defined by that which is recognizable, but just slightly off kilter. And that seems to me to be connected to all of this, but I don't quite have the background to untangle these threads.
So I'm not sure if this will directly answer your question, Emma, but I was thinking about the different approaches to childhood given by, say, Nietzsche or Spinoza or Deleuze or Jung. And I do think it probably is somewhat pertinent to that familiarity. For Nietzsche, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the child is sort of like this exemplar form of active force and being able to play for the sake of playing and without reacting to anything else and just doing what it can do. And in some ways, when we're talking about this wonder that could be engendered in childhood, that seems like it could be pertinent to that. It's very different than what Spinoza would say, just coming from my background in Spinoza studies as well, which he often is very, I think Mark Fisher uses this term as well, but he kind of treats a child as abject sometimes. Because a child's incomplete, doesn't know what it's doing, doesn't know why it reacts to the things that it reacts to. And then you have that more Deleuzian perspective of becoming child, dissolving boundaries, which is somewhat similar to Jung using the child as an image of rebirth. Now, that can get dicey if that's rebirth just to discover like a closed self. It depends on how you take your notion of the Jungian self. Is it more dynamic or is it a closed whole? So all these theories seem to be saying something different, but I do think there's commonality there. Again, when Nietzsche's talking about the child as this paradigm of experimentation, that's a very important, for Spinoza, that's how one experiences joy itself, is to experiment to see what one can do. There's that critical mode as an adult of trying to reapply that because you're trying to understand exactly, well, why am I thirsty for this rather than just a child grabbing for a bottle of water? What are my motives for things? So it's almost a rediscovery of that sort of affectation that maybe Nietzsche is getting at in his example. And active joy is something that transcends both that active joy that Spinoza speaks of, where I'm acting from myself, for myself, or collectively. That's not reacting to something. That's more a collective power. And I kind of wonder if that is sort of what you're getting at with the uncanny and that familiarity, where it's not just, okay, difference and being torn down by something greater than me, but acting collectively without some sort of something transcendent over it, sort of acting ethically. That's sort of where also I believe in capitalist realism. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Fisher talks about how he thinks Spinoza would be very good for this kind of paternalism without a father. I think that's the term he uses, because he gives the example of how Spinoza says with Adam and Eve, well, it's not because Adam disobeyed God's law, but because he ate something that was bad for him. And it's that sort of immanent ethic. And the experimentation of a child, I think, is in a way a good visual for that, even if Spinoza didn't put it that way. And you see that dynamic register both in Deleuze and Jung, and sort of that child is almost a rebirth or reconstruction or deterritorialization motif. I don't know if that answers your question, but that just sort of resonated with me as you were talking about it.
Yeah, no, it helps me link a few things up in my mind for sure. I'm sympathetic to the Deleuzian view of the child as you just laid it out. But what occurred to me as you were speaking is this idea of the viewpoint of the uncanny. And I'm directly referencing the introduction to the weird and the eerie when I'm saying this, is very much from the inside. When we are children, when we are surrounded by the familiar in our home environments with our close family, we're deep within ourselves, looking at everything as nothing but ourselves. It's the view from within. It is not an objectifying view. It's a view that starts, even if one is not aware of this, as one would not be until you're a certain age. The awareness that prevails when you are so young or so abject, or in a power dynamic, if you are on the inferior side of the dynamic, if you are the student or the worker rather than the teacher or the boss, the consciousness is very much contained within the self and on the self, and seeing everything as an expansion of the self. The opposite of that is what Fisher attributes to the modes of weirdness and eeriness, where a weird and eerie encounter is one where you are seeing something from the outside looking in and sort of objectifying it and seeing it for what it is. So if you see the child as, if we can try to bridge some of this and see the child as, yes, in one sense, abject, a la Spinoza, and also in the way that Fisher talks about Spinoza. And he definitely does go into this in Capitalist Realism and a few other writings of his, I think. In that sense, the child doesn't have real freedom. However, if there's this immanentism, where everything is just about what you do and you're not thinking of a transcendent register, a God or a father, there's kind of this almost, it's like a sandbox for ethics. Instead of making a decision about, like, frankly, do I have sex with this person and what are the ethics of that? It's like, do I eat this thing? That's kind of what's going on with the child. And this is all, to me, connected to the didacticism of PBS, where it's kind of like there's almost, a sandbox or like theater quality to the actual stakes of what you're going to be dealing with once you're old enough to be past the PBS age, perhaps. Like there's this ritualized, quote unquote, unreal aspect to it. But now I think that I'm almost going off into too many different directions.
No, that's great. Actually, I think Jung might offer something useful to what you're talking about here, where in some of Jung's writing on education, he comes at it through a few different registers, but one of them is the young child. Similar to what you're talking about, everything is sort of subjective. There's what he calls a participation mystique with the parents, and therefore the parents' problems are also the child's problems. Jung associates certain dreams that he gives examples of that children have that clearly come from the affects of the parents. And obviously just a classic example of some sort of generational transmission there. And one of the goals for education in Jung's mind is to sort of cultivate that realization of difference. This is also my former supervisor, Roderick Mayne, wrote a book on disenchantment and enchantment from Max Weber and tying it with Jungian theory. But there's sort of that level of naive enchantment at first, which everything is connected. There's nothing but connection. Why wouldn't there be connection? And in some ways, I do think whatever affect or virtue that we're talking about with PBS, there might be something there related to that. And then obviously reality hits one in the face and suddenly it's disjunctive in a exclusionary way. And suddenly you don't have all those connections anymore. But Jung talks about that sort of being very much seeing the family as within you, so to speak, early on, or just society within you, so to speak, early on. In addition, he does talk about a more than that sort of living spirit or the collective unconscious, where the way he talks about it in terms of, well, it's not just the parents, but then grandparents and society itself, it's connected. That's very much, to me, resonated with in Anti-Oedipus, I believe it's in chapter 3, where Deleuze and Guattari talk about intense affiliation, where, yeah, you have the generations, but then literally just the collective intensity or aggregate of intensities of where someone is born into really matters as well in sort of these transversal ways that we always can't account for in a linear fashion. So again, Jung talks about this naive enchantment that then gets partitioned in the process of disenchantment. But the big question is that third step within Weber's theory of re-enchantment, which I would imagine someone like a Fisher would say, there's a lot of commodified false options to do that don't really do anything, right? Or that's very much bound to sort of the capture of nostalgia and a return, or it's just a return to a naive sort of enchantment, which doesn't work anymore. I mean, reboot culture, I think, is very much an example of that, where, okay, let's go back, let's redo that. But it's not getting at anything novel or new because there's sort of this crisis of what can be new as well. So there's sort of that question of how does one, is that lost? Is that sort of wonder, that term I keep using, partially because this whole discussion too, slight sidebar, slight tangent, reminds me of the late Helen de Cruz's book, Wonderstruck, which she was a wonderful and very earnest writer and talked about wonder in a very earnest sort of way, but sort of something that if you're going to carry it into adulthood, basically it has to be cultivated in a very practical way to some extent. And I think that sort of ties into this as well. How do things not just, because we can't just go have some sort of an anti-dramatic swing back towards naive enchantment. How do we go towards something new beyond just the dissemination of everything, the destruction of everything as well?
I was supposed to have Helen on the show for that book before she passed away.
Oh, that sucks. Yeah, that was a huge bummer.
Yeah, really sucks. I'm trying to use this conversation as a way to think new things. And something that kind of came up just in listening to you go back and forth on that, particularly the thread that Emma put out there about the uncanny and, let's say, domestic home life as being an infusion of everything that's familiar. Think about what it was, for example, that PBS in particular tried to do was it attempted to instill a sense of community that went beyond family. So what was the base unit of organization for PBS? It was the neighborhood. It wasn't the family. It was also the friend, too. Somebody like Mr. Rogers. First of all, Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, I'm in your neighborhood, and he has this paternal function, so to speak. And I mean, let's face it, Fred Rogers, there was something quietly androgynous about him in a way, like he wasn't overly masculinized or anything. And certainly your friend, one of the standout sort of Corduroy Psychedelic experiences that I had was watching the episode of Mr. Rogers where he takes you on a tour of the applesauce factory. And so he had this unique capacity to do so many things. I mean, just to awaken the imaginal world that lives behind or adjacent to your house in the form of a little kingdom with a little trolley that he interacts with that doesn't have a voice. But also he is this psychopomp who takes you into the organs of productive capitalism as well, showing you where the applesauce comes from. This is also this sort of double-edged sword, once again, of the PBS experience, is that it was essentially a truly liberal / progressive intervention into global capitalism, attempting to mitigate all of the excesses by it. Like, well, what if we just create the neighborhood? But we're not going to examine the economics of the applesauce factory or what the working conditions are necessarily on the factory floor. There's just a kind of hypnosis instilled by just you viewing the production of the apples, right? And all of that's well and good, and it's educational, but there is that dark side to it, the thing that national broadcasting couldn't address, especially as it moved deeper into neoliberalism. And now in the age of Trumpism, has been almost totally defunded and eradicated. But I don't know if there's anything on that aspect before I pivot to something that I want to ask Emma.
Yeah, semi-related to that, but I think my brother works for Radio World magazine, and he sent me something just the other day, just of how there was a influx of requests for licenses for public broadcasting stations within the past 5 years, post-COVID, really, like a very high amount. And now all these people have licenses, whether it's across the country. I mean, very rural areas with public broadcasting. And one of the powers of them, obviously, is it does create sort of like a community hub beyond just the immediate family, perhaps. But with the killing of funding for it, suddenly a lot of people have these licenses and are endangered. So they have to turn to, say, private funding. I think it was the family that owns the Los Angeles Clippers just gave a ton of money to public broadcasting to try to keep it afloat. And of course, with private funding, while in some ways it could be nice, you also wonder if there's drawbacks to that as well in terms of where's the money coming from? Does that therefore demand certain liaisons, et cetera? But I mean, one of the questions, Craig, that you put in before this podcast was just, okay, well, why does it no longer exist? And what would be the reason for slashing public broadcasting? I think in some senses, I mean, there's tons of reasons for it politically and materially, but one reason is this idea that where you could have a broadcasting public radio in Stamm, Virginia, that is completely independent and forming new connections and community outreach can be a dangerous thing too. Within certain factions of the state, it's not in their interest to want to have that around. So of course it would get minimized or destroyed or replaced with something commercial as well. But yeah, that idea of community outreach, even though sometimes it as you said with Mr. Rogers, also going to a factory or whatever sort of shows an ignorance or glossing over the dark side of it. But there was that capacity to form a new assemblage or new connections that might be lost now as well.
Yeah. That just makes me think of one quick thing, which is AM radio. And after having read an older essay, well, a much older essay by David Foster Wallace recently about the rise of the right wing through AM radio, and we're going to be doing an episode on Acid Horizon soon on the concept of cultural Marxism and the new book by A.J.A. Woods, which to a limited extent discusses the new right's co-optation of the AM radio streams and forms of alternative media, which, from the standpoint of progressives and radicals, we can't overlook the fact how useful AM radio in particular has been in radicalizing the new right. I don't know if you've ever accidentally landed on an AM radio station here, East Coast, West Coast. Some pretty abhorrent things pour out of
sometimes against my own choice. I had to listen to that too. Yeah.
Like if you're working in a truck with another guy on the way to a catering gig or something like that. Yeah, no, absolutely.
This is a return to something Craig was talking about a few minutes ago. The Mr. Rogers episode where he's taking you through the applesauce factory. This is a total throwaway comment. But as you were talking about that, two things came to mind. First, the opening sequence to Blue Velvet. Second, the opening sequence to the film Uncut Gems. My guess is, I'm sure both of you have seen Blue Velvet. Lynch's sort of canon in the communities we travel in. With Uncut Gems, well, with both of them, I should say, they come to mind because they're both tours into and through the unseen. With Uncut Gems, I don't remember it specifically, but you see the on-the-ground operations of gem mining that is connected through time and space and all sorts of different vectors to the Diamond District in New York City, where it takes place. And Adam Sandler's character is this jewel seller involved in all sorts of stressful situations. That's the whole film. But in these opening sequences, it's so dramatized. It's so stylized and affected. And I'm just thinking that there's got to be an essay or a chapter in there somewhere about these sequences that are incredibly aesthetic, they're artful, and they're dreamlike. I mean, the term psychopomp is correct, whether you have the figure there like Mr. Rogers or it's the directorial work that's doing it for you. This very guided, narrativized tour through something that you don't normally get to see. And you got this little glimpse into it. And it sets the stage for an encounter that wouldn't be possible if you didn't have that opening. I don't have the theoretical materials to go any further than that, but I had to make that connection.
Well, it's also worth saying too, and just to kind of go back to a previous point that I had, the pacing and flow of that journey that you go on through the applesauce factory might be intolerable under normal, totally convalesced circumstances. But in the hypnotic sort of well of being sick, once again, there is this sort of psychedelic quality to it that it doesn't just make it tolerable, it makes it quite inviting. Especially when I had like a bad case of the flu, for example, it's hard to watch Price is Right. There's a lot of lights, there's a lot of sound, and the pacing is just much faster. Whereas with the PBS kids documentary, there's long droning sounds of factory equipment, no dialogue for large tracts of the episode or whatever it is that you're watching. One of the things that I'm interested in is that within the ordinary, if one were able to attune one's consciousness to these more ordinary operations, ordinary encounters, however we want to put it, in the world, there's really just a well of aesthetic pleasure just at our fingertips in our world right now. But sometimes it's so hard to access that because of the pace, not only of modern life, but just the apparatuses and devices that get in the way of that sort of sustained interaction with something like a tour through the applesauce factory. In the whole Corduroy Psychedelia blog piece, while I was writing it, it had occurred to me that, and this is the first time that I really saw it that way, is that there's a sense in which hauntology and acid communism and Fisher's work, not that they're opposed to one another, but the demands that they make on our imagination might be a little bit different and maybe are in some sense even contradictory. And maybe you can even clarify or correct my understanding of this, because there's a reading of hauntology which I think just asks us to be or dwell within the image. And the premise that I put forward in the sentence about acid communism is that there's a way in which Mark Fisher suggests that perhaps our imagination can be conscripted for some sort of political purpose. And I think there is a tension there. Maybe it's because that essay wasn't complete or revised or what have you. And I was curious what your take on that was.
So for those who are familiar with the ideas of hauntology and acid communism, I still think that we don't have the theoretical tools that we need to understand both fully and in particular, both in the context of Fisher's work and more generally, how we might use these concepts to understand all sorts of things. I don't think that we have what we need to understand it fully, understand these two ideas in relationship to one another and how we might use them with any real ability to build with them, essentially. So hauntology, I think, comes to people much more intuitively than acid communism, which after years of writing about acid communism and seeing it treated as at best a curio and at worst anti-intellectual in certain corners of the internet, because I think people really misunderstand it. I've sort of come to a place of peace with it where I just kind of accept now that I think it's going to be illegible to a lot of people because, first of all, you need to, I think, really be conversant with Fisher's work to understand how it fits in with everything else. And even just as much the thinkers with whom he was in dialogue as well, to really see how it's not simply saying that we need to do a lot of LSD or that the images of the 60s are of any particular use to us. It's something quite different from that. And hauntology, first of all, is so sadly appropriate for our age because things are really, really hard right now. Everybody's exhausted. Everybody's depressed. A few people, I think, have the energy to train their attention on something that can really travel far from inner life. As much as we might be doom scrolling or involved in concrete forms of political activity and organizing, as I think a lot of people should be if they have the means to do so right now, even if you're doing what you can do to keep your mind and actions directed towards affecting political change. We are so in ourselves, we're so deep in our own constructs and ourselves that theories that immediately speak into the back of our head, so to speak, that take us into parts of ourselves that are not validated as we travel through the internet or in the course of our shitty jobs, our employment situations, our relationships, that they're not seen and made space for. I think that people really gravitate towards those. And I think that hauntology scratches that itch, that it takes us to a wing of ourselves that seems a bit magical, even as, to me, there's an ineradicable darkness about hauntology. Whereas acid communism, the key to acid communism is in what I was just talking about with respect to Fisher's understanding of the weird and the eerie, where it's really, really hard to see what he was getting at unless you understand that it connects to weirdness and eeriness as modes of perception that are not rooted in a consciousness of the self and that look outward and understand the way that you're feeling, seeing, making sense of things as not your own, but as part of something shared in what we could call a kind of objective reality, not in the sense that Ayn Rand talks about objectivism or that what Fisher would call buffoon empiricists talk about objective reality, but in the sense that what we're perceiving and feeling is real and objective to the degree that it's shared. And he believed, drawing on the work of feminist epistemologists, I think Nancy Hartzog, who he doesn't write about in The Weird and the Eerie or Acid Communism, but he was lecturing about at roughly the same time in his master's lectures at Goldsmiths. We need to construct the conditions to be able to feel and then relate to each other in everyday life and as part of our explicit political projects, that it is all real and outside of ourselves. And this was very much just the background, the premise of what people were doing with anti-capitalist political organizing in the late 60s and early 70s. And what has been lost, that thing that hauntology tells us we could have had but never did, and that we're now sort of stuck endlessly sort of dwelling on, that thing is in fact possible, is the premise of acid communism. So I think we actually need an integrative reading of the two in a very simplistic, reductive, maybe even mildly problematic way. I sort of see these two as the poles of a manic depression, where we actually need to find our balance or our line of triangulation, if you will.
I guess my only challenge or concern, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here too, is And to bring it back to my initial claim about that, I believe the conditions of revolution, or one of the fundamental conditions of revolution, are a shared cultural or affective overtaking of whatever our affective orientation is now, because clearly it's certainly not enough to reverse course or to overcome any of the problems that we're dealing with. Even in hearing you describe how we are to go about engaging in political action, it's almost as if the language of obligation is circulating beneath all of it. Like, this is something that we must do. We need to do this in order to. Granted, that's simply conditional language, but at its lowest level, I wonder if the impulse towards radicalizing and politicizing for a lot of people, or at least enough people to make something happen, functions at that level of a sort of nagging obligation, which they just don't want to respond to. And then if they do respond to it, it will be responded to in a reactive sort of way. At the other end of the spectrum is the sort of overweening activist mentality, like, you guys need to do this now, we're doing more over here. And of course, that absolutely grates on many people for whom something like a revolution would absolutely benefit them. And then when I look at like the whole Boards of Canada situation, there was an aesthetic feeling that just immediately gelled in this one small region of the global cultural aesthetic space. And what was happening there seemed to evoke a kind of spontaneous unity that I want to see happen in a political domain. It's almost as if those things are divorced in some sense. And, I'd hate to do this to my boys, but at the end of the day, a new album, in some sense, is just a record that you pay for. That's a very reductive way of looking at it. But then when you look at the community and the affective investments involved there, those are the kinds of things that, just by a certain conditional standard, need to be plugged into a revolution in order for it to happen. I'm just sort of elaborating the symptom, if you will, and maybe you have something to say about that.
I think that all that I have to say about it is that we can't tell people what to do anymore. I think the sense of obligation that hounds so many of us, anybody who understands what's going on right now as fascism, that's the word for it. Anybody who is sensitive, frankly, I think everybody in that category, and I would like to think that that's the majority of people, but that's maybe a little too optimistic of me. They're all so tired, and they're all tired of wondering what to do and feeling put upon and feeling forced to act and to speak in certain ways. And while a new album from Boards of Canada or any other musician or a new work from any artist that might be inspiring, that might return you to a state where you can at least simulate what it's like to not be exhausted, it might be just that. And this is taking place within the inexorable context of consumer capitalism. But I wouldn't necessarily sign off on it being apolitical. And I don't think that that's what you're trying to say. So I'm just, yeah.
I was just simply playing devil's advocate, coming from that particular position that doesn't think those sorts of interactions or encounters are political. I completely agree with you on that fact. They are. I think it's simply a matter of teasing out the political dimension and finding where those contours meet with the contours of the explicitly political, I guess you would say.
And I think it's important to frame them as such, which is maybe just me endorsing the very project that we're all participating in at this very moment with doing this podcast. Is the line that I hear constantly, because I've been politicizing things that a lot of people feel strongly should not be politicized throughout my career, especially psychedelic experience, to a lesser extent, music, literature. There's this sense that if you frame it as political, that you're just expanding the territory of the bleak, of the de-eroticized, that you're just pushing the grayness into the brightly colored areas of the sensual, the erotic, the magical, and the spiritual, religious, etc. And in doing so, you're just ceding further territory. And to me, that only comes from an impoverished concept of the political and the societal. It's only bad if you have a view of what it means to want to work together with other people, which is what politics and society are about. That's going to seem gray and bleak. And I just don't see politics as being about that. We can tease out what the word politics means, not right now, whether you'd call it politics or not, just working with other people to have a good shared life, essentially, and not seeing music, literature, culture as anything outside of that, but as in many ways what gives it life and allows it to test out new possibilities. That's why I keep doing this, even as I worry that these projects are not always fully legible and can seem anti-magical, anti-romantic in some sense.
What Emma was saying actually reminded me of a conversation that we had about the limitations of Jung's The Undiscovered Self and the connection of the imagination to politics. I don't know if that would factor into your response, but maybe you wanted to put your piece out there.
Yeah, while going through your provisional question list for this whole discussion, I was thinking about The Undiscovered Self also, just because that's a very late work for Jung in his career. And in a lot of ways, it is his most political work. And it is flawed because so much hinges on the individual rising above the common man. And there's not a lot there in terms of, it's always the onus on the individual to improve before there can be any sort of socius that Jung seems to deem acceptable. And there's obviously a lot of flaws in that perspective. And it's just indicative of Jung, even when he starts to get out of this pool, he still tends to stay in the pool of having an introverted bias towards how he approaches a lot of things. But there's another aspect of Undiscovered Self, which I always have kind of liked with a lot of caveats, which is needing to acknowledge that sort of living spirit, or just because it's a word that keeps coming up in this conversation, let me say affective spirit within a society. I mean, his big thing in that book is, countries that don't value the unconscious and the affect, they get rigid, they become these static creeds and they can't hold themselves up. Whether that's a accurate description of what went wrong in the Soviet bloc or whatever, that's neither here nor there. The point is that's what Jung's big thing is in that text. And I do think that does have a lot of cash out to, again, what I think has sort of been a running thread through this whole discussion, which is the affect. And to me, that's really important to everything we're talking about. We always have this gap between a purely materialist or Marxist perspective and a very materialist way of how to fight things. And then we have this imaginal or idealist perspective, and how the hell do you meet in the middle? Can you meet in the middle? Is there a middle to meet it in? And to me, and this is both Jung, Spinoza, and Deleuze rattling in my head, but affect is sort of at the center of that to me. Now, there's many gaps there, and Emma, if I'm way off base, please tell me. But to me, at least for Fisher, affect seems to be more of a collective thing, or in the instance for depression, sort of handed down throughout the whole collective, whereas certainly with Jung, we're talking about it in terms of the individual. Spinoza is a nice little shortcut for me on that sense, because yes, the affect is individual, but everything's an individual. We're individuals within an individual. Individual loses its meaning in any human sense in Spinoza. So again, we're talking about this very early idyllic period of childhood and being able to just naively imbibe a certain wonder. But then once we enter that larger individual adulthood, the state, your 9 to 5, 401ks, all that dumb shit. Like suddenly the affect just, you're getting transmitted something that was never yours to begin with. It comes back to this idea of a memory that maybe wasn't strictly mine personally. The resources for that are in Jung. Craig and I have talked about this many times. Jung, I think, shoots himself in the foot sometimes getting those resources out because, again, he wants to keep things towards a structured ego and unconscious. Hillman and this depth psychology of extroversion. I mean, extroversion is the needed thing here because extroversion is connection, outbound connection, transversal connection, however you want to phrase it. Gives you that needed to let the image just kind of riff with it, to go off with it. One of the reasons I always come back to Jung, and he certainly fatigued me many times. One of the reasons I do come back is there is that sort of centerness between idea and matter with affect that he is very keen on. And he seems to be very aware that that's very important just in terms of like a metaphysical praxis of how are we going to do psychology? How are we going to do things? And it brings it back to that affective register that can be in between. How does that lead to, okay, well, affect in terms of we can reorder images in a way that might engender better affects collectively? If I knew the answer to that, that would probably round off this whole discussion. I have no clue, but that seems to be sort of, for me, that third way in between. Emma or Craig, I don't know if that resonates with either of you, but that's a very important topic to me.
Well, maybe as we round off the discussion, we'll lessen the stakes a little bit, because last night you and I went back and forth on Discord about diners. I just wanted to talk about diners a little bit because
hell yeah.
aside from PBS, I mean, maybe the one thing that the Gen X and millennial generation, I mean, maybe to a limited extent, some Gen Z folks have, is the whole diner experience as a site of socialization, but also this kind of hauntological entity, if you will. Where I lived growing up or being a teenager in the mid-1990s, there were about 6 diners where young people would hang out anywhere between the hours of 10:30 and 2:30 in the morning, maybe later, maybe sometimes 4 or 5 a.m. But what's interesting is in terms of not only the class character of diner culture during that time, this was another site for what I'm calling the aleatory encounter. You would go there not knowing who was going to show up, who you'd see. Where I lived in the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, there were different cities, and people from other cities would trek out to adjacent cities to go hang at the diners to see what the experience was like there and maybe make new friends or new enemies or what have you in those places. The interesting thing to me is in that time, it was presented as a given. This is just where we are going to socialize and interact. But with the coming to pass of their importance in our culture, and perhaps smartphone and internet has something to do with it because now that's the wider vector of socialization. What I found interesting about the particular diner that was in my hometown is that they remodeled it and they overlaid it with this Art Deco aesthetic as if to point to the history of diners. But that diner was not Art Deco or anything like that. Like the real history of that diner was, first and foremost, it was created by Greek immigrants and folks from the global South working secretly in the back and probably living in the adjacent living quarters. I actually worked at that particular diner for a summer, and I knew that for a fact. Guys from Honduras, Ecuador, and elsewhere working back there, you never saw them in the community outside, like at community events or anything like that. And then, of course, a couple of years down the line, that's where you hung with all your friends, saw all the goth kids from the adjacent town and everything else. But to me, it's interesting that the overcoating or the recoding of the diner involves imposing this false veneer of American history, Americana, in the form of this Great Gatsby bullshit that they're hanging on the facade, which was nothing like the true history of that diner. And also, these days, it's totally a throwback. So all the Gen X moms and dads are bringing their kids and their families there, and it's much more domesticated, much more safe, and doesn't have any of the sort of liminal contours that it once had. And since you brought it up, Bob, maybe you have something to say about that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Part of this idea, well, I guess it was sort of a constellation of ideas that occurred to me the past few days, but one was on Blue Sky. Someone, and I can't remember what their name was, which is fine because I'm going to kind of trash what they said, but they were talking about, the diner experience in New Jersey, present day. You go into a diner and they have the same sort of characteristic style and it's the same menu. You don't have to look at what you want. It's the same thing and it's always there. It's open 24/7. And not to do a regional discussion on here, North and South Jersey, not very pertinent to anything. However, this person has obviously never been south of New Brunswick, because diners in South Jersey, where I am, are an endangered species, if not extinct. Quite frankly, they've been wah-wah'd out of existence. And then I think COVID killed the rest, or many of them. And the ones that do exist tended to have leaned more on the boutique side, or maybe local farm-raised stuff, which is fine. But then I would also say also have that Art Deco sort of superficial trappings to them often too. So, I mean, they're not really the diners of the past. They're not in late high school or early college going to Harvest Diner on Route 130 in Cinnaminson, New Jersey at 2 a.m. with a friend to write a screenplay that never saw the light of day after that, right? Like, oh, those were the times, man. Those were the times. So yeah, I mean, the diner is definitely a lost space. I was telling you this, Craig, too, but it's an example along the lines of what you wrote about in your article, the casinofication of America, in a different way, where, so shout out to anyone listening from Burlington County, but Sage Diner on Route 73 was a big hub for me and people I either worked with or went to school with. And it closed years ago, but its husk just was standing there between car dealerships and 7-Eleven, Dunkin' Donuts, whatever. It's just been there forever, as many diners have. Well, recently I found out it got converted into a dispensary, and they even made like an Art Deco sort of signage for it, Sage Dispensary. So they know people coming there, probably when they were younger, were going to that diner. So it gives you that nostalgia output, but it's also now just for a different form of pleasure and sort of that, maybe like that sort of escape into a cheap hedonism, whatever, right? Like other diners in the area have been converted to urgent care. So these husks being used for new commercial purposes, I thought was very relevant and resonant with what you were talking about in the casinofication article. The other thing I would want to say is I worked in an office for a number of years for my day job before they gave me the blessed choice of being able to work remotely. Again, this is something I just noticed in terms of an aesthetic, even in fiction writing, which I think has been antiquated, going to the diner, even as like a cyberpunk or sci-fi thing. To me, that's kind of antiquated because I just don't think that's a vessel for people anymore. That alliteratory space, butcher that healing space just that's not there for people anymore. In my experience, at least just regionally, what people do after work is they get in one person's car and you almost circulate whose car it is from the office. You go to Wawa, you get drinks. If people vape or smoke, they do that. And you just bitch about your workday. And that's sort of all it is at that point. And the car itself is it's very much like the smartphone to me in some ways. I don't get this because I'm not a car guy, but I would see friends from work post on social media, whatever, just hanging in their car with the radio on. What's the playlist on? How's my car decked out? That's part of just, I don't know, this balkanization, this segmentation, this sort of just privatization of experience, even further down with the phone, which of course is plugged into the car so you can get sort of that full social media experience within your hermetically sealed vessel while you have your soft pretzel and your drink. So yeah, I mean, that whole space of community is just completely gone, and it becomes even more just diffuse and deterritorialized, but highly coded to this privatized space. And I just thought the death of the diner was an interesting vehicle for that.
I'm laughing, but there's a few things that for the listener that we need to go over. First of all is Wawa, because this is a very mid-Atlantic philosophical discussion, very niche, generationally speaking and geographically now. Everyone should look up the Wawa convenience store online. When we were kids, by the way, Wawa used to not be cool. It used to be the opposite of cool back in the 80s. Anyway, that's a totally different discussion.
That's before my time. Yeah.
Yeah, we used to make fun of, like, I mean, there's the whole your mom jokes and your mama jokes, like your mama came from a Wawa grab bag. Maybe that's not to the taste of most listeners, but that's actually how it went. But now in Pennsylvania, those convenience stores like Wawa and Sheetz have this sort of mythic status. And I would say if you're listening and you're not from the US, and maybe even some people from the US don't even know this yet, but the whole Buc-ee's phenomenon, the mega convenience store. You got a Buc-ee's thermos right there with the Spinoza.
So I got a Buc-ee's thermos and then the Spinoza politics bumper sticker on the back. So those are my two unresolved extremes.
Amazing. One more thing I wanted to mention before I pass it to Emma, but Yes, the creation of the dispensary and the new gloss that has put on drug use culture has stolen something from the head shop of yesteryear, where back in the day, you could buy a glass bong, but you could also get like maybe a clear pair of nunchucks or like some sick wicker chair or something like that too. And of course, a drug rug to go with it. But Emma, I think you're surrounded now by the Pennsylvania and New Jersey boys. And I know the whole like New York diner experience is probably a little bit different, but is there anything relatable within the cultural discussion we're having and maybe even some of the philosophical offshoots that come from it?
Yeah, all of it, because I lived in Pennsylvania.
Oh, that's right. I forgot.
In my life, on and off. Well, I lived in South Philly in 2011. I lived in Pittsburgh, and then I lived in the mainline area, and also going out into King of Prussia and Lancaster County. So on top of that, I lived in Southwestern Virginia for 4 years and was frequently at that point driving up to Pittsburgh, up I-81, back and forth through West Virginia, and also driving to see my family in New York. So Buc-ee's, Sheetz, I actually was just back in Virginia and had a long philosophical conversation with a friend about Buc-ee's. So this is a very...
Wait, what's your take on Buc-ee's philosophically?
Well, it is an enchanted space.
Oh, totally. It totally is.
It is. It's so magical. And I think it has to do with the specificity in place, because time and space have now been completely... The only word coming to my mind is fucked, actually, by the internet, by algorithms. I mean, I could use more gentle, eloquent language, but this is the low stakes part of the conversation, the more buttoned down part. It's the pilgrimage aspect of it. Because whenever you're going to a Buc-ee's or a Sheetz, you're on a journey. You're on a journey in space. And journeying through space is so precious. Now, gas has been so expensive on and off since I was in my early 20s. I remember when I was learning to drive as a teenager, it wasn't quite that bad. What I'm getting at is that traveling through space is a luxury under late capitalism. I feel very confined to specific spaces, as so many of us do. And then you get to a place that feels simultaneously free from class aspirations and like an open field. And we can actually connect this, I think, to the experience of the diner. So absolutely New York diner experience. I am aware of the Philly, Pennsylvania, Jersey variations of that, but not nearly so well. I grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York, which is a city and a town, and the city side of Poughkeepsie had its heyday in the 60s and 70s and has been frankly depressed economically, and various parts of Poughkeepsie are just completely poverty stricken. And at not the literal center, but the psychic center of Poughkeepsie, to me, is the Palace Diner, where I spent so many nights as a teenager and in my 20s. And what you describe as the aleatoric quality, the connection I'm making to Buc-ee's and Sheetz, a little bit this is true for Wawa, but not quite as much. I think there's something else going on with Wawa.
Oh, we see where you come down now in the convenience store wars.
I do love Wawa. I know Pennsylvania well enough to get the Wawa magic, but it's not the same magic as the Buc-ee's and Sheetz magic. But Buc-ee's, Sheetz, and diners, they have this sense of almost being spaces of free play within a high context, very rigid structure. And when you think about what diners actually offer to people, to me, it's not a true diner if it's not 24/7. You need to be able to go there at 3 a.m. and either get your 8th drink of the night or start drinking coffee to be at your work shift at 9 a.m., as one would do in your 20s, 24/7. And the menu is just remarkable. I mean, people who come from parts of the world where you cannot get something like that, they see like this 9-page menu with tiny font where you can get everything from a sort of esoteric salad to pancakes to cocktails and what have you.
Wait, what is an esoteric salad?
Well, I mean, the diners, especially as we got into the aughts and diet culture where people were focusing on eating a lot of salads. And in the 90s, it was like you would get your standard Caesar salad, a house salad, maybe a Greek salad, because many of these establishments are run by immigrants from Greece. But now a lot of the diners, it's like the cocktailification of pubs. Like they've got salads that have like balsamic strawberry goat cheese situations or yeah, so something like that. So you can get all sorts of shit at a diner and anything can happen. It feels like it's fine to hang out there for 4 or 5 hours, especially late at night. And it's from an older era of capitalist industry. The era of the automat is sort of the precursor to the diner. Like I'm not going to be able to describe this very well, but automats were super mechanized, automated sort of fast food places that I know existed in certain cities, but Fordist production put into restaurants to the production of food. But we're not looking at an era of capitalism that had been completely neoliberalized, I guess, and rendered so total that you couldn't have spaces where it's actually fine to go hang out for 3, 4, 5 hours and maybe not spend a ton of money. So diners really consolidate all sorts of cultural and political specificities that they make it a kind of a singular thing. And then when I think about the simulation of the diner effect. So for people who are really not familiar with diners, I really divide in my mind between a real diner and a fake diner, rather reductively.
A purist among us. Keep going.
In Dutchess County, of which Poughkeepsie, New York is the county seat, there's the Palace Diner, which is a real diner. And then a few miles up Route 9, you have the Eveready Diner, which is just nothing but self-conscious 1950s kitsch. And it's not open 24/7. And it's very, it's too self-conscious about it. And the fake diner is it's part of the draw to a fake diner is the same reason why people like Funko Pop toys. It's the pleasure, I think, in experiencing culture as an object and something that you can enter into through a prefabricated mechanism. And I would never want to be there slightly or very drunk at 3 a.m. I think it would feel bad. Whereas a real, and I mean, of course, fake versus real. I'm not in my full-on philosophy brain when I'm just cleaving to this binary. Yeah, I mean, I could keep going and saying so much about it. I don't want to alienate people who don't understand this at all. But there is, I think, the last thing that I would say about this. It's very much a regional thing. I haven't spent enough time on the West Coast to know if anything like this exists out there or at all, except in maybe like the Las Vegas extremely simulated form. I know when I lived in Virginia and North Carolina, I missed the hell out of it. And the specificity in place and time, I think, is the same thing that might make this conversation impenetrable to certain people is also what's going to make it so activating, hopefully, for others in a nice way.
I really have a lot to say about this, but I'll only say some of it. Well, first of all, I actually used to live along Route 66 in California. That then goes out further west. And there are many diners, particularly in the Glendora region of San Gabriel Valley. I'm thinking in particular here, that were famous diners along that route. And they fell victim to the same sort of landmarkification. Well, I would say that the landmarkification of the Route 66 diners is distinct from what we're seeing on the East Coast, where the fake Art Deco thing is coming. Whereas those Route 66 diners, they do have real Hollywood credentials, the signed headshots and photos from actors and musicians that are there are the realia of those spaces, and they stay there, but they don't have the same sort of, at least in my experience, I could be wrong because I wasn't a teenager when I grew up there, but it seems like those spaces tend to attract an older crowd, and they're all about the Saturday and Sunday breakfasts, and maybe even the breakfast for anyone over the age of 65 or 70 retirees. That was my experience. But of course, all kinds of people were there, families and what have you. It just didn't seem to have the same sort of collision of truck drivers, goth kids, and everything else that you would find in the mid-Atlantic diners. The other thing that I want to do is, if you are Japanese and you're listening to this podcast right now, I invite you to take revenge on all of the Americans going to Tokyo and filming themselves doing backflips at the huge intersection in like Shibuya and like places like Shinjuku and stuff, and really just sort of like mucking up the scene over there, and come over and enjoy yourself in a Buc-ee's for the afternoon and film some content while you're in there, because this is, in some sense, the pinnacle of 21st century American consumer capitalism. I think a lot of things are going on there because the people who are driving there typically are millennials and Gen X and boomers, for whom maybe diner culture was something in their youth. And now the experience of Americana has coalesced in this space that has somehow merged Walmart, Disneyland, and Wawa all into one. And now the low prole experience, and I think this is a harbinger of something frightening coming down the line, because there will be a point probably in the next 10 to 20 years where places like Disneyland will be largely unaffordable for many Americans. And a place like Buc-ee's where you can stop and get a 64-ounce Coke and some of those beaver nuggets. And not to mention something off the barbecue grill there too. I don't eat meat, but that thing smells good. And not to mention having these exceptionally clean bathrooms that have red lights and green lights to show that they're occupied. Really, it's a stroke of marketing genius. As I'm suggesting here, I think it's anticipating partly a shift in American culture where recreation and enjoyment, just like you were saying, Bob, it's not about the diner space anymore. It's about hanging out in your car. And just to like bring in Emma's thread too, yeah, it's part of the American pilgrimage aesthetic alongside our way of socializing in these capitalist consumer spaces, alongside becoming ever more insular inside of our cars, inside of our little travel bubbles, if you will. And I'll just say, just to kind of round off my Buc-ee's riff, is that when I go to Buc-ee's or I stop there, I feel like 2 times smaller than I actually am. The gas station is so large and the building itself is so large, you feel like you are a miniature. And so in that sense, I think that from an affective standpoint enhances the sense of collectivity, albeit artificial, that Buc-ee's evokes. We go in there and we feel just like an ant in a colony or just something much smaller. There's a collective experience of diminution against this enlargement of this next iteration of Walmart and the recreation to come in the next 10 to 20 years. I don't know. Bob, maybe you can have the last word in this discussion as we cap it off.
Well, at some point I'll have to know why Wawa is a different kind of magic. But one other point too, we might be past this. This might be already an artifact, but I don't have anything intelligent about this. I don't know if someone else has written about this, but I used to be fascinated by the gift shop at a Cracker Barrel, which, to be cognizant of our listeners, if someone's not from America, Cracker Barrel is just a franchise restaurant that offers like a bogus rustic country appearance. And you can go inside and get like really greasy fried chicken or breakfast or whatever. But in a Cracker Barrel, there's a gift shop where, depending on where you are, like if you're at a Cracker Barrel in New Jersey, you could be at a Cracker Barrel in Texas or wherever, there will be gifts for that region. Like, for instance, you could go and you get a pillow that says New Jersey on it, or the Garden State, whatever, if you're going to a Cracker Barrel in New Jersey. And what really fascinated me about that is, yes, these location, they're usually strategically placed near a interstate, a highway, whatever. So people are traveling. Maybe they stop by and get their Philadelphia Eagles mug before they leave the Philadelphia area, whatever. But you also get a majority of people who are just living in that area who go there and they still browse the gift shop and they still might buy something, whatever. And it just gave me this experience of, wow, this is like Americans being tourists in their own area and just buying stuff that's so superficially removed from it at the same time. You know what I mean? Where it's sort of just, we have this experience of being a tourist in our own land, even though it is, in theory, I'm from here. Why am I buying that New Jersey pillow from Cracker Barrel? Maybe I'm buying it because it looks nice, but it's almost just activation of, oh, yes, I'm a tourist here again. And I feel like the passage to Buc-ee's is doing something else. It's less about that. It's less about that experience of maybe of being a spectator or a tourist in your own area as well, more just being in awe of this supersized cathedral of everything, almost this apotheosis of the big gulp of supersized Texas sort of products and such to just turn to the nth degree. So you get that all in this one simple cathedral, which is why when I sent a picture of me at Buc-ee's for the first time to a friend of mine, he gave back the canned line of there's sometimes only cathedrals that the eyes of the mind can see or whatever, because it had that sort of faux overwhelming effect. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that can be taken from these different vessels that we inhabit.
I actually just want to highlight that last thing you said. I think that's so opposite, that phrase, Americans becoming tourists in their own country. There's a reactionary way of looking at that where, oh, it's about immigrants crowding it. This isn't what we're talking about. It's that consumer culture itself has grown so large as to outsize our own sense of place here in the United States. And Wawa, Sheetz, Buc-ee's, you are firmly responsible, and we will have our revenge.
Not sponsors of the program.